So today we're going to talk about how you can get out of the New Zealand tax system. My name is Leo. I help online entrepreneurs legally reduce their taxes while living abroad by setting up offshore structures and relocating to tax-friendly countries. Today we're talking about New Zealand and how to get out of their tax system. This is very important because a lot of people go wrong when they open offshore companies and they set up fancy structures and maybe they even get a new tax residency, but they're still within the home country's tax system. And today we're looking at New Zealand and how you can get out of that, because until you do, then nothing else works. So we're going over the 183-day rule. That's pretty straightforward. Permanent place of abode, that's a bit more tricky. And then the 325-day rule. Before we get into New Zealand particularly, you need to realize that there's 3 separate ways that a country can decide to tax you. There's 3 separate tests that countries can do. And the easiest one is solely a day test. So for example, Thailand has a very clear in or out. If you spend 180 days in Thailand, within the tax year, you're paying taxes in Thailand. If you spend less, then you don't. As simple as that. The UK, they have a more complicated test, but again, they'll give you a number of days where if you stay a day above, if you stay a day under, that changes everything. If you stay a day above, you're going to have to pay taxes. If you pay a day below, you don't need to pay taxes, right? This is like the particular test in the UK. It says if you spend fewer than 90 days, the number of days on which you work more than 3 hours is less than 31. It's very clear. New Zealand, you need to get through your head that it doesn't. So other countries, US taxes based on citizenship. If you've got a passport, they'll just tax you. And then you've got the broad test countries, and New Zealand is part of these, and they have a 183 days test. If you spend 183 days in New Zealand, then you're a tax resident. But if you don't, then what determines your tax residency? And all these countries are very broad tests by saying, where's your habitual abode, which basically means like, where do you usually live? Where's your domicile, which is like, where do you keep going back to? And this is where the concept of civil residency versus tax residency actually overlap. And New Zealand is part of these countries. So you're not really going to have a very clear in or out rule that you really need to follow. So let's get into this. New Zealand is part of these tests. And the first test that we need to look at in New Zealand is if you spend over 183 days, you become a tax resident of New Zealand. And this become is super important, because once you're in it, it's harder to get out of it. And obviously, if you were born in New Zealand, chances are you're in New Zealand's tax system, right? And once you're in, the 183 days doesn't even apply to you. It just becomes you're in until you get out. So if you spend 183 days, you become a tax resident of New Zealand. Let's assume you were born there, and now even if you spend less than 183 days, you're still a tax resident in New Zealand. Because once you're in, you're a tax resident of New Zealand, and you're supposed to pay taxes in New Zealand until you get out. So then the question becomes, well, how do I get out? I'm glad you asked. Number 1, you're away from New Zealand for more than 325 days in any 12-month period. And the second one is you don't have a permanent place of abode in New Zealand. Now let's get into a bit more detail. These two, they both need to be met if you want to be a non-tax resident of New Zealand, right? Let's look at the first one. You're away for more than 325 days in any 12-month period. So, this basically means that there needs to be a whole year, so 365 days, where you only spend 39 days or less in New Zealand. So notice how it says you're away for more than 325 days in any 12-month period, which basically means you need to spend 326. So by extension, on a 365-day period, you need to spend 39 days in New Zealand or less. Now, each part day counts as a day spent in the country, so be careful about that. Even if you leave the country at 8 a.m., even if you land at 11 p.m., even if you stop over, right, for a flight, that still counts as a day. So let's say you're leaving on the 10th of June from New Zealand, that day still counts. Let's say you're landing back on the 15th of September, that's a day that counts towards this 365-day period. So this is quite straightforward. You need to do a bit of math, you need to be super careful, but here's where most people go wrong. They'll do this whole 325-day thing. They'll stay away from New Zealand for a whole year, but then they'll come back to the country. And what you need to understand is this first test is not enough on its own to break tax residency. Remember what we said before, right? You have 2 tests. You need to satisfy both. The first one you can satisfy, but you also need to break the second test, which is the permanent place of abode test. Now, second test is you do not have a permanent place of abode. Now, what does this mean? What the fuck is a permanent place of abode, right? This is actually quite complicated because it's not straightforward. So we're actually going to go to the New Zealand website. This is the IRD government website, so we're going to let them explain it to us. A permanent place of abode, as explained here, is you have a permanent place of abode if you have a place where you usually live in New Zealand. And what does this mean? You know, maybe you don't own anything, but maybe you've got parents' house there. Does that count as a place of abode? And the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, they make these tests broad on purpose so that if you make a lot of money, then they can come and catch you, right? So let's just read through this. There's somewhere such as a house where you normally live in New Zealand, even if you're not there all the time. You do not need to own the place. The place does not need to be vacant while you're away. You might own a house and rent it out when you're not there. It's somewhere you can call home in New Zealand. And this is bullshit, right? Because if you're from New Zealand, you're probably going to call New Zealand home. And that's completely fine. We just need to work around it. So ties to New Zealand, here it gives a bit more context as to what is a permanent place of abode and what does it mean to have one. And it says that you may need to consider what your ties are, right? So how often you return to New Zealand, how long you spend there, family and social connections, economic interest, employment or business connections, and whether you intend to return to live in New Zealand. Again, very broad. So how often you return to New Zealand, how long you spend there. There's no like number of days where they're like, oh, okay, this is fine, okay? If you spend less than this amount of days, then you're all right. If you spend more, then you're not. You kind of need to do a bit of guesswork. And the way you fix this and you satisfy these criteria and you're like, okay, yes, I don't meet the test to be a tax resident of New Zealand, is show that you have a permanent place of abode somewhere else. So now, of course you're going to call home New Zealand. Of course you're going to go and see your parents. Like, that's completely fine. Like, what kind of kid doesn't go and see their parents? Like, of course you're going to call it home. But the way you do this is you focus the variables, okay? So you try and spend not a lot time in there. Definitely less than 6 months, ideally less than 4. How often you return to New Zealand? You know, ideally you return briefly, maybe for holidays to go and see your family as a guest. Family and social connections, you can control this. This is usually spouse if you've got a wife or if you've got kids. So luckily this doesn't apply to you. Economic interest, this is superannuation funds. This is probably like banks. Are you using New Zealand banks? Are you not? You run a New Zealand business, so this is the next one. Where do you intend to live? This is intent. This is very hard to prove. I guess what I'm really trying to say here, if I go back to the presentation, is that the more money you make, the less ties you want to have to New Zealand. So spend less days in New Zealand. Have less money in New Zealand banks. Like, oh, you can open a bank account somewhere else. Have less assets. I don't know if you've got a car. Cancel gym memberships, even things that are so small. As I mentioned earlier, the easiest way to prove we don't have a permanent place of establishment is to show that we have a permanent place of establishment in another country. So you have a 12-month rental lease, clearly. You have a residency permit or a visa that allows you to live in that new country. You have utility bills that show that you live there. You have a tax return, you file your tax return in a different country. You have a driver's license, maybe an official document. You have a local bank account that you use. And I'm not saying you need all of these, but because the test is so broad, the more money you make, the more you want to make your case airtight, that you don't have a permanent place of abode in New Zealand and that you have it somewhere else. So to the extreme, if you had like 15 million, you just park your money in Singapore, open a bank account there, get an apartment, get a visa, open your business, and you wouldn't even, you know, have anything in New Zealand, right? If you're making less, then you might be thinking, okay, maybe I can stay like 3-4 months in this country. I'll still maybe have a 12-month rental lease somewhere cheap, like, I don't know, maybe Malaysia, maybe KL, maybe Bangkok, I don't know, and have utility bills in your name. Maybe you try and open a local bank account. In Thailand, you can get a driver's license very easily. File your tax returns, right? So you can clearly show, hey, look, I'm actually living somewhere else. I want to give you the F1 example. I always give this, right? I don't know if you watch Formula 1, but most drivers have their tax residency in Monaco. In Monaco, you pay 0 taxes. There's no income tax. There's no capital gains taxes. No one pays taxes in Monaco. And the F1 drivers and tennis players have their tax residency there. But a lot of times, they don't even spend the whole 6 months in that country to get tax residency because they travel for work. Formula 1 drivers, they're always around. Like, they've got Grand Prix all over the world. In Singapore, they've got Grand Prix in China, Italy, Spain, US, everywhere. So maybe they don't even spend the 6 months necessary to get tax residency in Monaco. But how do they do it? They have their apartment, maybe they own it, maybe they rent it. They have utility bills. They don't file their tax returns because there are no taxes, but they have a residency permit. They bank in Monaco, maybe they bank in Singapore. Like, their life is clearly there. And they are making loads of money and they make it work. But they're making the case airtight by having all these connections to Monaco. And the other thing is tax non-residency is backdated to the first of those 325 days. So like, once you've met all these things, you don't have a permanent place of abode in New Zealand, and you've done the whole, year out of New Zealand, tax non-residency is backdated to the first of those 325 days. So for example, if you leave on the 1st of Jan and then you come back on the 31st of December, for example, the whole year, let's say you spent like 30 days in New Zealand, maybe within that year, tax non-residency is backdated, which means that you wouldn't have to pay taxes on that year that you've been away, right? It's backdated to the 1st of Jan, the date you've left. You might still have to file a tax return, but it'll be as a non-resident, which basically means you're only paying taxes on the money that you've earned in New Zealand or locally sourced from New Zealand. How do you get out? Very simply, you're away from New Zealand for more than 325 days in any 12 months period, and you don't have a permanent place of abode in New Zealand, which again can be proven by having it somewhere else. That's it. Hope this helped, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.